It has been a daunting task to cover the sweep of the Ottoman Empire, a period of 700 years from the early 14th century to the early 20th century, as well as the 300 years before the Turks actually enter into the Middle East. And it's even more daunting to understand what all of these achievements and this history means as a legacy to us today, and particularly to the peoples of the Middle East. It's something of a platitude to say that the Middle East is very much defined by its immediate Ottoman past. But what do we mean by that? How much is owed to the Ottoman Empire? In part, it's still too early to tell, because these influences will reverberate through the generations to come. But there are a couple of points that we can make about the Ottoman legacy and the Ottoman achievement. For one, the final stages of the Ottoman Empire, its breakup and destruction in the First World War, the excesses that were committed to defend the empire, that is only a small part of the legacy, although it's one that is painfully remembered today. These include the massacres of populations, the ethnic cleansing, the extreme nationalism on all sides. And one can see in these events the precedents for similar such actions in the 20th and 21st centuries, particularly in all of the successor states, whether it be the violence that broke out in Bosnia in the 1990s, or issues of sectarian violence in Egypt, or issues of who should control the regions of Lebanon, Palestine, Israel. All of these issues, to some extent, are laid at the foot of the Ottoman sultans. But in fairness, the Ottoman sultans had promoted a very successful empire for at least 500 years from Mehmed II, based on the system of the millet. The millet had complicated the diversity of religious and ethnic communities, but it had not created it. All of these communities were able to live side by side, at least until the 19th century, with reasonable tolerance to each other, and even at times some understanding. And that broke down under the impact of the threat of the West, the emergence of nationalist movements within the Ottoman Empire, the redefinition of the Ottoman identity into a Turkish identity, and it is only a small part of the overall story of the Ottoman state, and it's also a part of the story of how the Ottoman state confronted outside threats and the issue of modernity. It leads me to think of the achievements of the Ottoman Empire. These too must be remembered when we're trying to assess the legacy. I've argued in this class that in many ways, civilization of the High Ottoman Empire in the 16th century was the culmination of classic Islamic civilization of the Abbasid Caliphate. That the creation of literary Turkish was clearly one of the great achievements in Islamic letters. Today, the skylines of so many of the cities in the Middle East are easily seen to be Ottoman or Ottoman-inspired. The domed mosques created in the 16th century, particularly by Sinan, that brilliant architect of Suleiman the Magnificent, defined what a mosque should be, so much so that my own personal reflexes are a proper mosque is a mosque built by Sinan. And I once encountered that personally when I was in Hong Kong with a dear friend of mine, taken to see a mosque built by the Indian community in Hong Kong, and it's built in a long hall tradition, which in some ways is better suited for Islamic worship. And my immediate reaction without thinking is, this is not a mosque. Where's the dome? I mean, it's not the Suleymaniya or even that beautiful gem known as the Rustan Pasha Jami'i. And that's in part a testimony to the achievement of the Ottoman visual arts and architecture. Seen in its ceramics, its tile, in its mores and cuisine, in its sense of fine living, which the Ottoman political classes for centuries set as the standard, not only for the Islamic world, but even for Western Europeans, who well into the 18th century still looked to the Ottomans as a great civilized state and competitor. Yes, it was Islamic. Yes, they were on the wrong side of the religious divide, and yet it was still seen as a worthy opponent and civilization. So this should be kept in mind when we look at the less seemly side of the final stages of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. And therefore, perhaps it's best to survey briefly what the Ottoman legacy seems to mean to the various successor states. First, I want to look at the Balkan states, the states that grew out of the provinces of Rumelia. And here the traditions are varied. States with large Muslim populations, such as Bosnia and Albania, still look back fondly on the Ottoman Empire. They, after all, or their ancestors, profited immensely under the sultans, and they provided much of the administrative and military elite that are so important for the running of the Ottoman state. The confessional Christian nation states that emerged in the 19th century, to a large extent, they would like to turn their back on the Ottoman Empire. And in the nationalist literature of the 19th century, there emerged the image that the Ottoman Empire was a foreign occupation, one that would last anywhere from 300 to 500 years, depending when that area came under Ottoman control. And that the success of casting off Ottoman rule was also the success of an embryonic nation, a nation state. It's seen in the traditions in Hungary, where Habsburg victories are turned into Hungarian nationalist victories. Simply go to the National Museum in Budapest, and the great Habsburg sieges at Belgrade are represented as Hungarian victories. The Croatians exalt the defense of Guns, that fortress in 1532 that checked the advance of Suleiman the Magnificent. He had to call off his second attack on Vienna, and it's seen as a Croatian victory because the garrison were a group of Croatian mercenaries in the pay of the Habsburg Emperor. The Serbians and Bulgarians both like to conjure up images of their great medieval states, either in the 14th century and the 13th century, and then their defiance and defeat at the hands of the Ottomans, particularly the Battle of Kosovo, which still reverberates in Serbian national mythology to this day. And Miloš Obrelić, who reputedly killed Sultan Murad I, is hailed as a national hero. And these are extremely anachronistic, and the most anachronistic are usually the Greeks, who see Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor, as a Greek hero fighting and defying the Ottomans, and that Constantinople will one day become Greek again. And this is part of the national narrative that came out of the 19th century and still influences to various degrees the relationship of those Balkan successor states, not just to Turkey, but their whole Ottoman heritage. And it's important to remember that these states, built so much on Orthodox Christianity, depended a great deal on the success of the Ottomans, because starting with Mehmet II, the Patriarch in Constantinople retained the control of his churches, his properties, and that Orthodox civilization was maintained by the Ottoman sultans. There was no policy of enforced conversions, and the very resurrection of these states owed a great deal to Ottoman policy. Without the system of the millet, one wonders what would have happened to those Christian provinces in the Balkans. Would they have been Islamicized? Would they have been wrested from the control of the Ottomans and turned into part of the Habsburg Empire? And so it's important to remember that Ottoman policy actually made possible, in the long run, the emergence of these states, particularly in the 19th century, where Greeks, Romanians, and Armenians were translators to the Ottoman court, and they were the first to read about nationalism, about British liberalism, and concluded that maybe it was time for us to create our nation states. And so it's still a painful issue exactly what these Christian confessional nation states owe to their Ottoman past. The Arab provinces, there the reaction is just as mixed. The Sultan Caliph was Turkish after 1517. That posed a dilemma at the time to Arab intellectuals, which we talked about. There were all sorts of explanations that a Turkish sultan was permitted so long as he protected Sharia and, above all, protected Dar al-Islam, the land of Islam, from the infidels. And an entire theology evolved over the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, whereby at least the ions, the notables, the elite, the ulema in the Arab provinces could accept a sultan, caliph, who was Turkish from the House of Osman, so long as he acted within accordance of Sharia. And that justification broke down in the late Ottoman state. The sultans failed to protect the lands of Islam. First with the invasion of Napoleon, which was a real shock in Egypt and probably inclined the leading political classes in Cairo to accept, for instance, the authority of Muhammad Ali after 1811. It was seen in the failure to defend Libya in that brief Italo-Turkish war, and above all, ultimately, the failure of the Ottoman state to defeat the British and the Russians in the First World War. And so Arab nationalists, that especially as they emerged after the Second World War, held the Ottomans partially responsible for falling under colonial rule. Now, some of the problems of the Arab national states trace back to the arrangements made by the British and French in those regions they took from the Ottomans under the treaties first of Sèvres and then of Lausanne. And in some ways, the British and French were far more effective in defeating the Ottoman Empire rather than in profiting and running these areas as mandates, essentially hypo-colonies, in the aftermath of victory. And many of the difficulties that emerge are probably better laid at the arrangements created by the imperial powers after the Treaty of Lausanne, rather than so much the failure of the Ottomans to defend those provinces. Now, it may have been ill-advised to go in the First World War, but certainly the Ottoman army, as we've shown, performed far beyond expectation in the First World War until the final collapse in September 1918. And it's also significant that this attitude, this ambivalent attitude toward the Ottoman Empire, is seen when Arab states that were once part of the Ottoman Empire try to focus their loyalty and create a mythological national narrative of resisting the West. The real threat that they create is the attack of the Crusaders. The Crusaders are invaders, just as the French and the British were, and they really speak very little about the Ottoman Empire, and particularly Ottoman successes in the 16th and 17th century against the European powers. It's all part of that Ottoman occupation. And when they look for people who are heroes, it's Saladin, who ironically was a Kurd rather than an Arab, not to Suleiman the Magnificent. And it strikes me as very curious how many of them have this ambivalent attitude to the Ottoman legacy. And yet the Ottoman legacy was so important for the later stages of Islamic civilization. It's certainly witnessed a proliferation of Arabic literature and the chronicles and religious writing. The Arabs, the Turkish Sultan Caliphs were always above nationality. They ruled as rightly guided Muslim rulers, and Arabs who entered the Turkish elite and moved through the higher levels certainly were admitted into the Turkish ruling classes, and the notables who ran the various cities of the Arab provinces came to terms with the Janissaries sent out from Constantinople, created a new elite, which led to all sorts of advantages in trade and administration and local traditions being preserved. And the sultans were very, very good at not trampling upon local traditions in their Arab provinces. And so the preservation of so much of earlier Islamic traditions, and even down to social mores and habits and land tenure patterns, all of that was owed to the very, very sensible administrative policy of the Ottoman sultans, just as the survival of Orthodox Christianity was with all of its local associations in the European provinces. And that's a point not to forget of the success of this imperial order. And this brings us to the issue of the Ottoman legacy as it's understood by Turks today in the Republic of Turkey. I spent some time on the creation of the Turkish Republic for several reasons. First, it represented the core of the Ottoman Empire in the late stages, that is, Anatolia and Constantinople. It received the bulk of the administrative organization. It had many, many men who were both officials and officers who were trained in the late Ottoman state, who went on to build the nation-state of Turkey. And the modern Turks today, just as the Arabs, the Christian populations and Muslim populations of the Balkans find themselves a bit in a quandary exactly what to make of this Ottoman legacy. The easiest way of handling it was done by the Kemalists after 1926. Ottoman history was selectively presented as part of a national narrative, as was the case in the Balkans or in the Arab countries. But rather than an occupation or an aberration of the norm, it was treated as the prelude to the Turkish nation state. Emphasis was on the conquest of the Ottomans and the notion that it was a Turkish empire. But no Ottoman sultan ever saw himself as a Turkish sultan. The only people who ever called the Ottoman state a Turkish empire were Western Europeans, and they were just confused about the matter because they were imposing their values on the Ottoman Empire, a multinational state, with their own nations of either national monarchies or later modern nation states. Furthermore, the Ottoman legacy is often seen as very successful politically and militarily, and then not getting with the program after the invasion of Napoleon. Its failure to modernize. The modernization of the Ottoman Empire means the establishment of the Turkish Republic. And in the textbooks and in the popular literature that circulated in the 1930s, 1940s, and even down to today, the Ottoman state is treated as this sort of precursor to the true state, the true expression of Turkish identity, and that is the Republic of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, whether it is to be secularist, whether it is to bring back more of a Islamic tradition in it. But that's the narrative. And it leads to certain romanticizing of the Ottomans. For one, the most favorite is of this television series that came out in 2011. I mentioned it briefly before, and that is The Magnificent Century, the Muhteşem Yüzyıl, a favorite of 139 episodes that is set in the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent and has been the rage of the Turkish viewing audiences. My wife herself confesses that she loves it when she's watching it when it first was released in Turkey. It depicts the Ottoman imperial family in the time of Suleiman very much as popular series in the West like I, Claudius or The Tudors. It gets into the private lives. It is essentially an elaborate costume drama and soap opera and romance combined. And it's evoked all sorts of reactions. In Greece, the more conservative nationalists see it as a condemnation of exalting the occupying power. It's popular in Bosnia, which sort of identifies itself with the Ottoman state. In Turkey, it gets mixed reactions from more pious Turks who really resent the fact that Suleiman and his family are not presented as these icons or totems of great rulers. They might have possible weaknesses and vices. And part of the Turkish public sees it as, well, yet just one more action-adventure film in the tradition of a long line of novels and films set in the Ottoman Empire. But it does drive home the rather ambiguous feeling that most Turks have about their Ottoman legacy. Are they part of Europe? Or are they part of a wider Middle East? How much does that Ottoman legacy mean in creating the Turkish state of today? Well, the Ottoman legacy was extremely important for the creation of modern Turkey. So many of the institutions in modern Turkey, which are often seen as the model for any state, any Islamic state trying to modernize, go back to the reforms of the 19th century, starting with the reforms of Tanzimat. The conscription system, introduced in 1844 and modified successively, that is still present in Turkey, where there is a traditional conscription system that all Turkish citizens must undergo for 2 years. It is seen in the bureaucratic arrangements, and particularly in the understanding of the role of law, kanun, in daily activities, and the increasing divorcing of Sharia from day-to-day law in Turkish life, which has been a hallmark of Turkish legal developments already implied in the legal codes that were published in 1877, the parliaments, and is still being debated today in Turkey. It was the Ottoman state that made Anatolia the heartland of its empire. And Anatolia emerged as the center of one of the two centers of the Ottoman Empire. And when the Ottoman state collapsed, there were institutions and populations there that were able to build a new nation state after the destructive war with the Greeks in 1921 to 23. So the legacy is very much there. And furthermore, you can't miss it architecturally, especially when you walk in the city of Istanbul. Istanbul today is still home to some of the most magnificent mosques ever built. And the Turks feel a very, very strong kinship to that cultural and architectural and religious tradition. And above all, they really admire Suleiman the Magnificent. Otherwise, why would we have this television series in the first place? As I said, it went on for 139 episodes. And so that brings us to the question of what does the Ottoman legacy mean and how do we interpret it? All of these successor states have to come to terms with the good and the bad. Foremost, the Armenians. The Armenians remember the hideous legacy of 1915, 1916, and it still influences the Armenians in the diaspora as well as in the current republic. But they should also remember, just as the Orthodox in the Balkans, that the Armenians had for a long time prospered under the sultans, that the Apostolic Church of the Armenians was put on par with the Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, which represented all of the Orthodox populations of the empire. And this was a significant change from the position of the Armenian Church under the Byzantine Christian emperors, where it was seen as a heretical church that should either be suppressed or converted and handed over to the Orthodox clergy. Instead, they were given a position equal to that of the Patriarchate, and their properties, their schools, their traditions and languages were respected. The Armenians played an unusually prominent role in the development of the intellectual life of Istanbul in the late 19th century. Greeks, Armenians, and Jews prospered immensely from the reforms of Tanzimat, the later reforms and constitutional arrangements, especially in 1876. They were in the forefront of exploiting and profiting off the increased trade with the West, the whole penetration as a result of the commercial arrangements with Britain. And as a result, they were the literate and very active westernizing element in Constantinople. They were so important for the development of the theater, novel, film. Most of that was done first in Armenian and then in Turkish. And there was a symbiosis between that Armenian artistic and intellectual elite, that artistic elite, and their Muslim Turkish counterparts that made Istanbul such a great international city at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. And that fact, that important legacy that was so important in defining the Armenian identity, it makes it even all the more tragic that that community was destroyed in 1915 and 1916. But let's recall that up until those fateful decisions, there was a very important role played by the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, and the sultans and their government get a great deal of credit for allowing that Armenian culture and community to prosper so well under their rule. So all of these successor states owe a great deal to the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire, in my mind, can just stand on its own as a great civilization. It doesn't need to justify itself. And we do not need to come up with clever explanations on why we should study it. It stands on its own merits. It is a civilization as worthy as classical Greece and Rome is to those of us in the West. It is a great summation of Islamic civilization. It contributed so much to that civilization, a civilization and a religion that is destined to play an important role in the world no matter what happens in the future. It is also a very important civilization in innovating and adding and expanding that civilization. We cannot understand the success of certain successor states in the Middle East, the triumph of the Turkish novel in the international scene with the recognition of Orhan Pamuk as internationally acclaimed author, without understanding that all of this draws on the Ottoman legacy, and that as much as they're part of the modern world, they also go very back deeply into that Ottoman tradition, whether it be its letters, its arts, its understanding, and its political legacy. And so studying the Ottoman Empire in and of itself is a noble endeavor and just does not need a simple justification. Well, we'll understand this specific event today because it was so in the Ottoman Empire. Understanding history is much more sophisticated than that. It's getting a full sense of what that earlier civilization was like and how those who've descended from it look back upon it, draw upon it, make use of it, and use it as a way to create new institutions, new artistic traditions in the future. And that brings me to my final conclusion of what I feel about the Ottoman Empire and why it is so important in my mind. Suleiman the Magnificent, his reign and his achievements to me are the epitome of the Ottoman legacy, and for a number of reasons. First, he and his notorious wife, Roxolana, Hurrem Sultan, dominated the 16th century just as their distant Christian predecessors, Justinian and Theodora, dominated the 6th century AD. Suleiman is better remembered in the Islamic tradition as the lawgiver. It was under his auspices that Islamic law and the rulings of the caliph sultans were codified into a system that could be applied across the empire and could also accommodate customary law. And that legal tradition was analyzed and summed up in the Machele or the Majalla, the law code issued by the second wave of reformers in Tanzimat, promulgated in 1877. And that law code, in various guises, was used by the successor states, including Israel, down in some instances to the 1960s and 1970s. No small achievement in the continuity from the Ottoman past into the modern age, that the legal system, especially in civil and private law, was so well worked out that it continued to be used for all those centuries. Suleiman, however, is just one of a number of figures that are admirable from the Ottoman legacy. And if I were to pick one that I think that really sums up what is one of the great lessons that comes out of the Ottoman state, it's not one of the sultans, even though I've spent a great deal of time on sultans. But it is the reformer of Tanzimat, the architect of reform, Mustafa Rashid Pasha. He attempted to carry out reforms, to come to terms with modernity as represented by the Western powers, the penetration of the empire by Western economic interest, and the traditional order of the Ottoman state. He was born in 1800 at a time where the Ottoman Empire was rapidly being changed under the impact of the West. He was by instinct conservative. He believed in the truth of and the power of the Ottoman Sultan Caliph and of the great legacy to which he was born into. And yet at the same time, he was a clear-headed reformer who tried to preserve those traditions and that traditional order by adapting what he could see was best from the West and in some instances from the very foe of the Ottoman state. Many of his reforms never succeeded. Some actually generated more opposition than success. But at least in his effort, he gets an A. It was a remarkable effort undertaken by a clear-headed, pragmatic statesman. And above all, what I take from Mustafa Rashid Pasha is a tradition of looking back to the past, understanding history, and trying to reconcile it with a changing present in order to meet the future. In this way, Mustafa Rashid is an example to all of us why we should study the Ottoman history, why we should study any history. And he stands out as one of the great figures of the Ottoman Empire, and all of us are richer for knowing about his vision, his successes, and what it meant to preserve that great Ottoman state.